Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well, and for this video I decided to test SMT or simultaneous multithreading or hyperthreading for Intel case, but I'm using AMD, so SMT it is. So this one is going to be quite an extensive testing, so if you're looking for specific games, just look for timestamps down below. And first of all, I wanted to check the synthetics, especially in pure multithreading performance. And looking at AIDA64 numbers, I noticed that the latency has increased a little bit, which is a little bit interesting, but memory performance is more or less the same. So at least for AIDA64, if you are chasing for latency numbers, I recommend enabling SMT. I think for single CCD it should be the same outcome as well. The next program is going to be CPU-Z. Now straight off the bat I have to say that single core performance seems to be a little bit lower than usual. Usually I get 660, but this time I got lower results. Maybe something got installed in the background, I'm not sure. But they are at least consistent for now, and it seems that even single thread performance has increased a little bit without SMT, which is rather strange. And of course, multithreading performance is a lot lower, about 24%. And as I mentioned, single core performance has increased by 1.3%, which is basically nothing but still measurable difference, so I think it's worth pointing out. And the last synthetic benchmark is going to be Cinebench R23. And what's the damage? I tested only multi-core performance, and without SMT the performance dropped by 19%. Also keep in mind that my current CPU configuration is completely stock, no PBO, no curve optimizer, nothing like that. Just memory tune and SMT disable or enable depending on the test. So now that we got a rough idea what's the current situation with SMT, let's get to the main course, of course, and that's gaming. The first game is going to be Cyberpunk, and I decided to test built-in benchmark as well, using low preset at 720p resolution. And it seems that this game, at least with SMT enabled in the BIOS, performs quite a bit better than SMT disabled. Also, this is a little bit confusing, but for SMT enabled in the BIOS test, I used SMT disable option in the game. So both are kinda disabled for SMT, but one is disabled from the BIOS and the other one is enabled in the BIOS but disabled in the game. So it seems that the latter performs the best in this case. Now what about the actual gameplay? Preferably with maximum settings. And for the settings I used completely maxed out with Overdrive, or in other words with path tracing enabled, at super low resolution as well as super low DLSS on top, to reduce the load on GPU as much as possible. Now for the test scene I used Tom's Dinner Alley or China Alley, I don't remember correctly, but this is pretty much the most CPU demanding in the entire game. And looking at the performance, it seems that the trend continues, being with SMT enabled in the BIOS faster than SMT disabled in the BIOS. It's not really that big of a difference, but still there is a little bit, especially in lows. With the update 2.0 and beyond, it seems that developers made some changes to how multithreading works in this game. Because I remember they used to be a little bit better for multithreading. And these days it seems that it doesn't really scale beyond 16 threads. Now coming close to the end of the benchmark, it seems that the averages are actually the same, but minimums and mostly 0.1% lows are quite a bit better on SMT ON, and minimums have improved by 8% and 0.1% lows by 21%, so that's quite a big difference. And I think it's time to move to the next game. Second game is Counter-Strike 2. I used 720p resolution, again to reduce the GPU utilization, and I used mixed competitive settings. So for the most part, pretty much everything is low, but textures are at high, and shadows are all, I think. Anyways, looking at the results, it seems that SMT OFF seems to be performing quite a bit better now. And this is empty server because of consistency. If you use bots, they will switch areas and it might not be as consistent. So Counter-Strike 2 doesn't really like SMT that much, at least with 16-core CPU. And pretty much everything is better on SMT OFF. Averages, minimums, 0.1% lows and 1% lows. 0.1% lows are a little bit, I'd say, on the equal side because they are not as consistent, but still it's a little bit better on SMT OFF. Now I really wanted to test all games as well, because as you may know, all games may prefer without SMT, almost unconditionally. So for this one I tested Gothic 3 with my custom-made configuration file, which increases draw distance immensely. But that comes with a cost, which is CPU performance. Now I wanted you to take a closer look at this specific stutter, because it is repeatable. And notice that without SMT, the stutter is a lot less significant. At the beginning it seems that SMT ON has better averages. It's not really as straightforward as it might look, but the stutters are less severe on SMT OFF option. So usually I prefer to test with ultra or maximum settings, but since I had this test done before, so I thought maybe I should include it as well. This is Assassin's Creed Origins, which is older game, made in 2016, and because it has really good benchmark tool with very demanding scene, I thought I should just use that instead of gameplay. And as you can see, for the averages, it doesn't really make much of a difference, but look at those lows. They are much better on SMT OFF option. From what I noticed, 0.1% lows suffers the most with SMT ON, and once you disable it, it actually goes pretty well, with the improvement of roughly 19%, which is quite decent amount, again as I said. And that's not all, 1% low have improved a little bit as well, by about 6%. Minimums and averages are a little bit better without SMT, but they are not really that significant, by about 1 to 2%. Now, when people talk about SMT or hyper-threading or simultaneous multi-threading, they often mention temperature reduction, and from what I saw, it's basically game-to-game dependent. Some games do decrease the temperature by a little bit, some others not at all. So it really depends what games you are testing. And at least with stock configuration of the CPU, the clock speed is also mostly the same. Maybe with Core Optimizer or undervolting you might find different results, but I'm testing completely stock configuration here. All in all, I think without SMT, it's the best way to play this game, and it's another point on SMT OFF configuration. The next game is going to be very recently released God of War Ragnarök. For the settings I used again maximum, and I reduced resolution as much as I could. Now unfortunately, even with such ridiculous resolution, I'm still mostly GPU bound, but you can see that there is a little bit of CPU bottleneck going on. And basically there's not much of a difference. Again, I don't know how it would look with stronger GPU, but SMT OFF just slightly teeny tiny is a little bit faster in averages and in 0% lows. Probably everyone knows this game, and of course it's Red Dead Redemption. This is very recent port from console versions, and it's running natively on Windows with maximum settings. This town, called Armadillo, is extremely CPU limited, and even at 4K resolution I'm CPU bottlenecked. So for the benchmark run I'll just walk a little bit around this town. Looking at performance, it really doesn't seem to be matter that much with SMT or SMT OFF. But you'll see later in the test that SMT OFF again slightly edges out a little bit. Without SMT, averages and minimums are just a little bit higher, by about 1 to 2% only. But again, it's not worse, so I guess that's a plus.
Bad news is good news! Newspapers for sale!
What do we have here? It's another classic from consoles, but it's full remake. For the settings I used completely maxed out, except resolution is reduced as much as possible, and used DLSS at low as possible setting, again to reduce the GPU load. Of course, if anyone doesn't know, this is Silent Hill 2, released very recently, I think this month or the previous one, just again like 3 weeks ago. Now as you can see, again with Unreal Engine 5, they are very GPU demanding, and even with such low resolution and DLSS preset, I'm again GPU limited most of the time. However, look at averages and lows near at the end of this test. You'll see that SMT OFF actually starts to beat SMT ON option, and averages, lows seems to have to be higher. So this is just another example how Unreal Engine 5 game is mostly GPU bound these days, but still the CPU performance is important to get good 1% and 0% lows. And this is not an exception actually. But of course, in order to reach that state, I would need maybe 5090, 4090, something like that. But win is a win, I guess. So that goes for SMT OFF in this game. For this one, for Black Myth Wukong benchmark tool, I won't do side by side because this was without recording and RTSS. So as you can see, there's basically minimal difference, but again, this is very GPU bound even with such settings. At lowest at 720p and at resolution at 24% of it even. So that's like what, 360p to 40p, something like that. So a really low resolution, and again mostly GPU bound. There's very minimal difference. SMT OFF edges out a little bit, but I think it's time to move on. What we got next? This is Witcher 3 with path tracing fully maxed out except resolution as always. The testing area is at Novigrad Market, which is probably most CPU demanding area in the game. And honestly, this really surprised me, because SMT OFF just completely destroys SMT ON configuration, and it's genuinely better experience without SMT. You can see that at one point the FPS drops just a bit below 60 FPS at around 59 for SMT OFF, but with SMT it drops way below 60 to 52 instead. Also 0% lows and 1% lows are a lot better as well. Even averages are higher, so basically this is slam dunk on SMT ON. For this one I decided to test one of Ubisoft open world games, and that's Watch Dogs Legion. For the settings, again, everything is maxed out except resolution and DLSS. And even then, I'm mostly GPU bound, but still the CPU seems to be limiting by a little bit. And here it seems basically no difference between SMT on and off. Sometimes the drops happening a little bit more on SMT on, but for the most part I would call this a wash. They're basically equal. And finally, for the last one is going to be good old Shadow of the Tomb Raider at highest preset at 720p. So, while the benchmark is running, what I think about all this? Should I use SMT for my 16 core or your 16 core? Basically it doesn't matter, or is Zen 4, Zen 3, Zen 2 or even Zen 5. I'd say for 16 core part you should disable SMT, honestly. And this is coming from someone who really thinks that SMT should be enabled for most CPUs, especially in these days in lower core count CPUs such as 8 core or 6 core or especially 4 core. Those should be on, but for higher core count CPUs, I think it's safe to say that it should be disabled, and I think I'm going to do the same, because this test was not only for you but for myself as well. It was super interesting to test, to see the performance, the behavior of different games. And yeah, going forward I'm going to disable SMT. I'm going to fix my OSD, and it's going to be less cluttered as well, with all those cores and threads on display. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that with shader compilation, and yes, some games have efficient compilation and all threads tends to be used, but it's quite rare to my experience. Most of the time you'll be limited by your hard drive or the compiler, because from what I saw from testing many modern games, my CPU utilization while compiling shaders doesn't really go above 50% with SMT on. So even without SMT it shouldn't affect shader compilation for most games. So yeah, main takeaway, for 16 core CPU I think you should disable SMT if you only game. If you do mixed workloads you might be well with SMT on, but yes, for gaming CPUs SMT off for lower core count CPUs it should be SMT ON, but for 12 core CPUs I'm not entirely sure. It's a little bit tricky. I think you could disable, but you could also leave it on. It really depends on you. So thank you very much for watching. It was interesting test. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you didn't mute my voice, because maybe my yapping is a little bit boring, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. So yes, thank you very much for watching and see you next time. Bye bye for now.